Welcome to this week's Two Men in the Middle. This is where two men in the middle of the country get together and talk about politics, current events, and other fun stuff. I'm Craig Huey.
I'm Brandon Koenig.
So, Brandon, we were off last week. I think Jason and I both escaped the Midwest to the great state of Florida. You had an event that you moderated last week. This was the I forget the council name. I'll let you just introduce it. But let's walk through the event you had and kind of talk through what that was about.
Definitely. So I'm on the board of directors for an organization called the Mainstream Coalition. So they're based in Kansas and Johnson County, and they focus on centrist policy positions and electing candidates from both parties who are middle of the road and centrist. And so they have waded into trying to do more programming and outreach. And one of their first programs was this panel, which I had the fortune of moderating and leading. With four members of the community, where we talked about the aftermath of the 2020 elections, what it meant for centrist policy going forward, what it means for candidates. We waded into a lot of issues from disinformation to conspiracy and partisanship and intense polarization, and how you overcome all of that and try to govern. And the four panelists included Barbara Bollier, who ran for U.S. Senate in Kansas, Representative Sharice Davids from the 3rd District, Stephanie Sharp, who's a former state representative and entrepreneur, now political consultant, and then Pastor Adam Hamilton from the United Methodist Church of the Resurrection in town. So it was a good cross-section of a diverse group of people, and the discussion went very well. I mean, the difficulty we had was trying to compress all of those topics into 60 minutes with four people. But we did engage on a wide variety of being able to understand thought processes and how to approach, people that have this, this mindset, people that believe in alternative facts that are not real, and how you engage in dialogue. So we ended the discussion with, what are solutions? Like, where can we actually go from here? And we talked about solutions that were community minded. And the Pastor Hamilton actually did a really good job of addressing how you engage with people that have been misled or have fallen into the conspiracy trap, and how you do it very carefully, kind of from a position of care. And active listening to just kind of open that door and get them to think about alternatives. And then we also talked about policy solutions. Like, what does it mean, voting reform, looking at nonpartisan blanket primaries, looking at the ranked choice voting like it's being done in Maine. What are some other things that we can look at, the influence of money in politics, and passing something akin to McCain-Feingold Part 2. So it was a really good discussion. We covered a lot.
And so Sharice Davids was there. She was the only active office holder at this point. Did she give any indication about how some of this, how the current environment is actually impacting the day-to-days of being in Congress and the day-to-day runnings of the government?
She did speak to that somewhat too. She said that it does make it very difficult to engage with some of her colleagues, particularly after January 6th. And knowing some of whom were culpable on the big lie and the misinformation and disinformation that was spread. And so she did say that makes it difficult, but that that she doesn't really have any other choice. Like, she has to work with members on the other side of the aisle to get anything done, even just, to keep the government operating and just the annual budget. So that was interesting. So it's I think, realization that, it's tough, and the polarization makes it tough. She did, speak to the fact that, one thing that does make it very tough as well is the fact that you have all these incoming members of Congress, freshman members, that are more focused on branding, and just, getting their personal brands out there over any type of policy work. And she did review kind of like her focus on, for example, COVID relief for the 3rd District, small business relief, what she did to push that. I think the day that we had the panel was on the day the House voted on the equality bill. So she spoke to that because she was a big proponent of that.
Yeah.
and what it means. But she did say it, the times have changed. In the last Congress, they had 20 something Republicans that had joined with them on the equality bill. A lot of those Republican members either retired or lost their races, and they were replaced by people who were more conservative. And so now they only were joined by, I think, 5 Republicans who voted for the equality bill across the aisle. So she said she's noticed that the bipartisanship, even on bills that they've voted on before, has decreased quite a bit.
I think, if we were going to talk about the COVID bill a bit later on, maybe this is a good spot to fit that in, because this is Saturday afternoon. And I believe that just recently in the last couple hours passed the Senate passed their version of the COVID-19 bill. That's really the only, I'll ask this as a question. I guess for me, that's the only expectation of a large piece of legislation that the Biden administration passes. I don't see any other path to take H.R. 1 or the recent bill that they passed, increasing protections for trans and LGBTQ people. I just don't see, there's just no path to get those going. The bill that just passed, the $1.9 trillion COVID relief bill, I think it's called the American Rescue Package. This had, popular support amongst Democrats and Republicans, and we couldn't get a single Republican to vote for it, I believe, in the Senate or in the House.
Right.
So with that on the table,
which is ironic.
There's just no path.
Yeah, which is ironic too, because
to do that.
Yeah, and it's interesting because a lot of local Republican elected officials, local Republican mayors around the country voiced their support for it. The Republican mayor of Oklahoma City, Republican mayor of Mesa, Arizona. So it's also a difference too, where you have Republican officials on the local level, cities and counties, that would see impact from this, who are much more pragmatic and supportive than their federal representatives. So there's a disconnect there. But you're right. This is the marquee legislation from the Biden administration. This was something they had to get across the finish line because Biden ran on COVID as his number one priority. And he had to see this get through. But this was also passed through reconciliation, which allows for just a simple majority. Budget bills, reconciliation, judges can all be passed with simple majority. Nothing else, though, can. Any other type of bill would run into that 60-vote filibuster threshold, which makes it impossible. And so that's a key reason why Democrats tried to stack this bill as much as possible and include things like the minimum wage, which ultimately ended up falling because of the Senate parliamentarian, because they knew this was their one and only vehicle to try to get as much across the finish line as possible.
And remember when, I think it was when the Republicans were trying to repeal Obamacare and they were trying to pass a replacement bill. And there kept this argument back and forth about, do we go for everything they wanted or did they try to pass a skinny bill? And there was this concept of maybe instead of trying to pass everything and then load everything you've ever wanted on top of that, maybe we could unpack this and pass more single issue bills, smaller bills, things that didn't have kind of the broad breach of these massive pieces of legislation that were happening now. I think the Republicans, that group of 10, tried to introduce something like that, but I think we've lost all appetite for that way of writing legislation. Now the process is when the situation arises that you can pass legislation either by 60 votes or through budget, the reconciliation process. And typically there has to be an outside force like a tragedy or an event like a pandemic to create the environment where these large bills can pass. It just seems like that's the way this is going to continue. And with the filibuster in place, there's just no way to break that logjam, because you could take the $15 minimum wage bill, you could pick that up as a separate bill. There is no chance in hell that passes the Senate.
No, it's never going to pass. And I think there is an opportunity, though, for example, with the minimum wage, if Democrats were willing to go for something that was less than the $15, something between 10 and 12, or have a stair-step approach within the next 5 years to get into 15, they could get some Republicans on board. It sounds like there's been some Republicans who have said, hey, we'll meet you here on minimum wage, but not here. But again, there you have progressives within the Democratic Party that want $15 and don't want to go any less. So I think that's the conundrum when it comes to something like the minimum wage. But I think there would be opportunity to get something done. And so you would have progressives say, well, that's not enough. But I would argue, I'm like, hey, the minimum wage hasn't been increased in 10 years. I mean, if you're at least able to increase it a couple bucks, that's at least getting somewhere, and isn't that better than going another 10 years and not getting it done at all?
Yeah, I guess, but what I struggle with is everybody knew this package was going to pass, and everybody knew the big parts of this. This was going to be a big bill. The Democrats were never going to go along with a $600 billion tightly controlled COVID bill that the Republicans suggested. So we all knew this was going to be another one of these 700-page monsters where people stack everything in that they've ever wanted at one time. So there's all kinds of money for local government, state government. There's money for infrastructure on schools. There is no avenue left just to do something for a single issue in how we're going about legislating right now. So with that said, all the Republicans can do is
looming over the process.
Absolutely. Yeah. So all the Republicans can do is stall and delay. And like you said, make these symbolic gestures. Have we entered a part where we're so partisan and everything is so tribal? Again, not supporting a bill that 75-ish% of Americans seem to support. Is there ever going to be a consequence for that?
That's a good question. I mean, because we've seen this time and time again on so many of these big issues, right? Whether it's COVID relief or gun control, gun reform legislation, there is widespread support for many of these issues, money in politics, campaign finance reform, but there never seems to be any consequence. And partially that's because of gerrymandering. And these districts are drawn away where there are no consequences because it really doesn't matter, because these districts are set to continue voting for the same reps based on affiliation, regardless of how the American public at large feels about a given issue.
And I think you would agree with the statement that in today's politics, optics is just as important as facts, policy, reputation. How something looks to the public is maybe the number one thing that you have to control if you're a politician.
Correct. Yep. Perception is everything. And in many cases, It's lasting because it's defined at the beginning.
So with that said, what is Kyrsten Sinema thinking? What is she doing trying to have this kind of McCain thumbs down moment when she votes against the amendment for the $15 minimum wage? But she also does it with this kind of smirk on her face. She gives this little curtsy when she does it and kind of stomps out of the she's at the center of the floor and kind of stomps back to her seat. It's just, again, the optics on that looked like she was rubbing it in and she was happy to vote against giving people more money. It's just, in the world where optics is everything, that just looks like a massive unforced error on her part.
It does. And, I'll say this. I'll start by saying I've always liked Kyrsten Sinema because I like her brand of kind of moderate, pragmatic, democratic politics. And I think she's been smart. But I think she's fallen into this trap of performance art among elected officials now, right? So she knows and is very aware of everything that's being written about her in the media now and how she's like a kingmaker, one of two with Manchin in the Senate, to get Democratic legislation over the finish line. So part of it is, I think, self-perception and reveling in the fact that she has this, just amazing power as an individual that nobody else has by virtue of the numbers in the Senate. And so, I think she was totally playing to the cameras and to the media and just like a kind of a wink and a nod saying, hey, I know, I have this power. I mean, I think she was also trying to invoke John McCain and his maverick ability because John McCain did the thumbs down when he voted against repealing Obamacare and basically killed Trump's chances at overhauling that legislation. Although this is very different than Obamacare. So trying to draw that comparison to McCain, which I think she may have been trying to do on some level, because McCain is very popular among Democrats and Republicans, and she's from his home state. So I think that could have been a play. But again, like you said, I don't think it worked. And I think it just came across as, just tone deaf in some ways.
Yeah. So if you're like Larkin from Oklahoma or Ernst from Iowa or even Moran from Kansas, when you do your next town hall with your constituents and you're in the middle of Iowa or Oklahoma or Kansas, what's the argument you're making for not signing on to this bill? Are you sticking with the fiscal argument? Hey, we're just spending money that we don't have. Are you sticking with the red states did it right, blue states do it wrong? Why are we bailing out blue states? What exactly what narrative would you use to explain to your constituents to why you wouldn't sign on to this relief bill?
Well, I think the one that most will use and focus on will be that this is a targeted enough, that it's too broad, and that it should be just tailored to those who have suffered most from COVID as far as job losses and economic stress and uncertainty. And so they're going to say that the income limits are not low enough, that we shouldn't be giving all this money to local governments and localities, because they will try to claim that some of these local jurisdictions are at fault because they did not plan accordingly, and we're just throwing money at all of them without any type of specific plan to only provide money to those governments that need it. So it's going to be a process and argument that, this is too broad and too much without focusing solely on those who need it.
Do you think that argument flies? Because, I get that by saying, hey, I wanted this bill to be different. I wanted it to be more targeted. But thanks to President Trump's actions after the election, we lost those 2 seats in Georgia, and we couldn't get that. So instead of voting no on something that provides you, the people of my state, all of these benefits, instead of voting yes for that, I decided to vote no because I couldn't get exactly what we wanted. I just don't understand how that's viable at this point in time.
I don't either, because I think it ignores the fact that you have local officials, local Republican mayors, like the mayor of Oklahoma City, mayor of Mesa, Arizona, who are fully in support of this. You have governors like the governor of West Virginia and the governor of Ohio, Republicans who support it. So those who are closest to the people that are impacted support this because they know their needs on the ground, while their federal representatives do not. And most economists agree that, while there's disagreement on how broad you should go when it comes to relief for an economic crisis like we're in, that it just comes down to the relief is needed. And both conservative and liberal economists say that that's what matters. And so it should pass. We need to inject, a stimulus into the economy to be able to weather COVID and weather as we come out of this pandemic. And it was similar to the thinking behind the Great Recession and the stimulus that was needed then. And, we have the, foresight and proof to show that it does work as well. If you go back to, what happened during the recession, it's what enabled us to get out of that. So, I'm very sympathetic coming from the right side of the aisle to, trying to spend too much and not, going too broad. But at the same time, I don't think that should be reason to just completely vote against it and not do anything.
Yeah, there's certainly times when you have to take a vote against something because it just goes against your principles. Or like you said, I just don't believe this piece of legislation is written correctly, or I can understand some of those no votes. This one, I just don't get. Because again, with the level of support that this is given out, with the situation on the ground in some of these states, I just don't understand what would be the downside of saying, okay, we overspent, but we overspent on you guys. We upped the number of people who could get the $1,400 check. Yes, we're giving money to make your school district better. This also makes Obamacare cheaper, where we're giving you more access to healthcare. After coming off the year that we have had, I just don't understand what is the philosophical, hey, I just can't bring myself, it violates my principles to vote for this. And I would like to say that there would be a some sort of penalty to pay for that amongst Republicans, but that would just be silly at this point.
Oh, that's wishful thinking, Craig. But you're right, because I mean, look at the senators from Georgia. I mean, they supported Trump's stimulus payments to Americans, and when he argued for increased payments, they supported them. And I think a lot of this is also just partisan. I'm trying to deny Biden like his signature achievement and political win as well.
But he's going to get this one. I mean, this one is the one that you can say, I held my nose and voted for because most of this money was for the people. Give him this one, fight him on other ones. I just from a sheer politics perspective, I was amazed that at least a handful of Republicans in the House and a senator or two did not vote for this in the Senate, that this was just a straight down the line party vote.
I was surprised, I was very surprised. I figured it would get some votes in the House and at least a few votes in the Senate on the Republican side.
Yeah, if I'm a senator, hey, Republicans, if you're not going to vote for this, what are you going to vote for? I don't understand what you would vote for then. Let's pivot a little bit. And
I don't either.
Earlier, or midweek, Texas came out and basically said that they were going to open next week, I believe, next Wednesday. The state is going to be 100% open for activities. This means sports. I believe this means live entertainment. This means movie theaters. It is all back online in Texas next week. Then the governor went the additional step of dropping the mask mandate. And this sent off a huge debate of, is this scientifically sound? Is it too early to do this? Brandon, just overall, what's your thoughts and impressions of Texas really being the first one out of the chute to say, we're done?
Well, I mean, I think that there's value and need to start reopening for sure, because we're at the point where we have 85 million Americans that are now fully vaccinated, which is great and really good to be excited about. And hopefully that pace will even pick up more with the Johnson & Johnson vaccine now going online. But there is
that fully vaccinated, or is that just first shot, 85 mil?
I believe that is well, you're right. I think that's first shot, so not fully vaccinated, but first shot, 85 million.
But you're after the first shot, your risks of hospitalization, death, it goes down. Yeah. Absolutely.
Yep, you're on your way to full protection. You already have partial protection, so that is significant. But I think with Texas, I feel like they're going from 0 to 60. In a second, like it's just full acceleration. And that's where I have some issue because yes, open back up, start lifting restrictions, but I have a real problem with lifting the mask mandate, for example, because you still don't have enough state by state in terms of vaccination, particularly among those outside of the senior population to warrant lifting the mask mandate, I think. Because I think until you reach inoculation rates of over 50 to 60% of your state's population, that's when you'd lift the mandate for masks. But until then, you're still below herd immunity. And so masks are needed until you reach herd immunity, which we're going to do via combination of vaccines and just people who get the virus.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's time that we start shifting our mindset from lockdown to reopen. And I think it's time for some states, particularly the ones in the South that have had warm weather, that those would be the first ones to target. So I think there is a way that Texas can do this and not see a massive spike in infection and hospitalizations and death. With that said, throwing off the mask mandate, that was just straight politics at that point. I think you could make a scientific argument based on the infection rate, the hospitalization rate, the number of people that are vaccinated. You could throw that all into the mix and come out with a logical scientific argument to why it's okay to start opening up Texas. But for the mask mandate, that's just straight red meat politics at that point. There's no science you can point to that said,
I agree.
Hey, folks, just keep your ass mask on for another month while we do this.
Yeah, premature. And that's the thing, Craig, at this pace, I mean, Biden is saying too that every American will be able to get a vaccine by the end of May now who wants one. That's only a couple more months. Like, why does it hurt to just give it a couple more months to keep a mask mandate in place? Like, and again, that is the least impactful, least intrusive of all of because again, you don't have to keep things closed if you wear a mask. You can move about in public, do almost everything you did before. So I don't know why you would lump in the mask mandate with everything else. It doesn't make sense, because that's the one fail-safe that does make a difference in just halting the spread as you start to open up. So I would not tie those two together.
And we have to connect the political dots too. If the power grid hadn't gone off and Texas hadn't had all those problems, which has caused a political nightmare for Abbott and the Republicans in Texas, they probably wouldn't have opened this early. I mean, this is the classic
diversion and a distraction.
This is you're all mad about this. This is Mayor Quimby, who in The Simpsons, who gives a political speech and says, I said something that everybody didn't like. It's not popular. Let me just say something now that's popular so you can all just focus on that. And I think there's certainly an element to Abbott kind of shifting the conversation to the opening more than the power grid. Which, by the way, I think I read that the Texas Power Grid, the organization that ran that, declared bankruptcy last week, I believe.
Oh, did they?
Yeah,
and it's interesting
they
because
declared bankruptcy. I think, and they said like the ungodly sum of money they overcharged people. Yeah, they're not giving that back either.
So is the state government of Texas going to bail out homeowners then that are facing these steep bills?
This is a great question. Somebody's going to have to be bailed out somehow, because there's no way that is going to stand. Either they're going to bail out power grid. No, it's just not. You can't let that stand. So in that political environment, yes, Abbott plays the lockdown ending card, switches the conversation. There's enough evidence in infection rate and hospitalization that he can justify this. Then he throws the red meat crowd a bone with mask, and Texas is off and running. What I think will be interesting to watch is we fell into, I think, the lockdown mentality very quickly. We understood this is a disease, this is a virus. If you get close to people, contact is how this is spread. And we seem to adapt very quickly to kind of this lockdown style. Even if, we weren't completely locked down this whole year. There's certainly been places that have been locked down more than us here in the Midwest, but it seems like we got used to this very quickly. What's your thoughts on the time frame for us to get back to that pre-COVID mindset? And how bumpy is that going to be?
It's going to be very bumpy, and it's not going to be all at once. And that's why I think it's difficult, I think, states like Texas to try to flip a switch and just say, okay, everything's back open. It's not going to be like that. It's going to be phased. It's going to be intervals, and you're going to have segments of the population that are completely supportive and in agreement with going out and about and moving about in public. And there's going to be other segments of the population that are not. It's going to take them more time to adjust. So that is something to be mindful of, that we're going to be at this at different rates, and it's not going to be all at once across the country. And so I would say you're looking at probably late fall before you start to see all of the country kind of in a mindset of pre-COVID, where everything's open and everybody's doing well. I think you'll see strides made, especially as we get into the summer, where we'll be, kind of it's operating at 70 to 80% normal, 70 to 80% pre-COVID, but we're not going to be 100% until much later in the year.
And I think too, the direction has to start coming out to help people understand we are not going to get to zero. We are never going to have a 0% no infection rate, or there's going to be a constant presence of COVID with us as we move forward. And that's okay. The goal isn't to get new infections to under 1%. We're going to have to start defining for folks that if the infection rate is under 4% and we are seeing under 10,000 new infections a day, that's the finish line. That's when this basically becomes the cold, the flu, the things that we deal with on a consistent basis, and we'll start treating it as such. It just feels like there's been so much talk about the lockdown, and we've been with this for so long that the time it takes to reorientate people to opening back up, it's going to take more time than I think it should. It's going to take a lot more information, and it's going to be a huge challenge for the Biden administration. So, Brandon, also on Sunday, CPAC, our Sunday was when Trump spoke, but last week, CPAC, the annual Conservative Action Committee conference, got together. And as we were warming up, you went to CPAC back in the day when CPAC was more policy driven, where it was there really to identify the platform that Republicans were going to. and
back before it was a comedy of clowns.
I throw this to you. What is CPAC? Who is it for? And most importantly, why?
Well, exactly. So when I went in from 2005 to 2013, it was issue driven. It was not personality driven. There were panels on different issues like criminal justice reform, immigration reform, where they gave both sides. They had people that had, pro and con on many of these issues. It was more welcoming to people who were moderates, conservatives, libertarians, every side of the spectrum when it came to right of center. And it's no longer that at all, obviously. I mean, CPAC now is a personality cult. I mean, it's Trump 24/7, and that started within the last couple of years. So since Trump assumed power, most of the speakers who were economists and people who were experts in their fields have been replaced with Trump aides, former Trump administration officials. And then this year, it was Trump 24/7. We saw the return of the Don Jr. and Kimberly Guilfoyle show, with the same theatrics. Yes, again. And then we had the statue, the golden statue of Trump, the golden calf is, people, I think, bowed and gave their and saluted that just ridiculous symbol of how the party has completely become nothing more than I think, political cult. So yeah, no. I mean, there's not a whole lot to say about it. It was just
so. I think both of us agree, just from a sheer numbers, volume, who the Republicans need to be relevant in national elections again is suburban, college educated women and men. That is whom the Republicans have to find a way to reconnect with. Did you see anything at CPAC that would make any of those people not just get violently ill and run from that as fast as possible?
No, I mean, because all CPAC was this year was grievance politics, obsessing over stolen election, this ridiculous rhetoric about election integrity, which is just code speak for, we have to fix the system because if we don't ensure that less people vote, we're not going to win again a national election. So there was nothing that was appealing to suburbanites. There were aspects and facets of it that were alt-right, neo-nationalist. The CPAC tried to keep the white supremacists and the really crazy people out. But a lot of those extremist people still got in and had a platform and had a presence. You had anti-immigrant rhetoric from people like Paul Gosar, who's the congressman from Arizona, who's pretty rabid anti-immigrant.
Who before CPAC spent some time at a straight-up white supremacist convention with a group that makes no bones about it and isn't trying to hide it.
Right, who's the leader of that was Nick Fuentes, who's a known white supremacist, one of the new ones on the scene, who is getting a lot of traction with the alt-right. So yeah, you have, and then you had Josh Hawley, who bragged at CPAC about his role in contesting the election results to much applause. Despite all of the criticism he's received, he's completely reveling in that. There was nothing that was appealing. I mean, this was groupthink, speaking to a narrow segment of people that are still so pro-Trump. The straw poll that people always look to understand kind of where conservative activist support is. Trump had what was 55% support,
something like that,
ran again among that crowd. I mean, that tells the story.
I mean, Cruz, Hawley, Jim Jordan, McCarthy, the usual suspects show up. And then Sunday, Trump is the exclamation point. Trump's speech was just a rehash of the same speech he's been giving the last 2 years. Nothing really kind of to see. I was really disappointed in Trump's CPAC performance. It really wasn't a good performance of his classic hits. It wasn't like going to see a band that hasn't been popular in 4 or 5 years, and they won't play the songs that made them popular, or all they do is play all their old stuff. There's no new content. Trump is not interested in creating any new content. If he can show up, if he can just do the 90 minutes he's always done, that felt like what that was. I didn't gain anything new. There was no new insight. It was just, again, whipping up a crowd that was there to be whipped up.
Yeah, that's all it was. I mean, and you have to understand too. I mean, Trump has been deplatformed, so he's a bit rusty. Giving his greatest hits. I mean, he's been like in the doghouse.
He's a performer who's been off stage for a couple months, and he just didn't have his fastball totally down. I don't know. I mean, what did Trump accomplish at CPAC other than getting Nikki Haley to come out and praise his speech after she ripped on him, the week before? Mitch McConnell came out and said, "Oh, if he's the nominee, of course I'll support him." After voting not to convict him at his impeachment trial, gave an impassioned speech how it was 100% Trump's fault. So, other than making those people once again put on a clown suit and look like morons, what is Trump trying to accomplish with going to CPAC?
Well, it allows him to tease the prospect of a presidential run. So he basically keeps all of the presidential contenders at bay, and they have to go and, on bended knee and kiss the ring to get his support. So I think what he's trying to do is send the message that he is still relevant. He is still the leader of the Republican Party, and that anybody who wants to run for higher office on the national level, federal level in the party needs to have his support. So I think that's what he's trying to do. He's trying to stay relevant so that he can enact some power over the rest of the party. So I guess from that vantage point, his speech was necessary.
I mean, every speaker at CPAC supported Trump and supported the idea of some degree of election fraud was why he lost the election. There was no the stop the steal narrative was very much alive at CPAC. So there is no evidence that the Republican Party in general is going to adopt a position that is contrary to Trump on anything right now.
No, they have made the calculation that they need Trump's support, and then they need to keep him in their good graces because they need his voters, and they were unwilling to risk losing his voters in 2022 or 2024. So that's a political calculus they've made. I think it's completely naive, and it's going to do lasting long-term damage, and they're going to lose more voters than they gain. And they forget that the voters that they gain that are Trump supporters are very fickle. These are voters that do not always turn out in elections, will likely not turn out if Trump is not on the ballot, just like they didn't turn out in great numbers in 2018 when Democrats picked up the House. So they are gambling on a group of voters that don't have a good track record of voting and turning out anyway. Let's not forget that a lot of the people that stormed the Capitol and were part of the insurrection had very spotty voting records, and that's for the ones who voted at all. So, again, it's a calculation by the party, but it's one that's going to be to the detriment of gains with the fastest growing shares of the electorate, the rapidly changing demographics, college educated voters, suburbanites. Those are the areas of the country that are growing. Rural areas of the country are losing population and continue to lose population at a pretty rapid pace. So, the numbers are there. This is just kind of a long yawn in trying to keep as much of that coalition intact as possible, rather than going after. I guess
if I'm Hawley or Cruz or Rick Scott or any number of the 25 people that are going to run for the Republican nomination in 2024, it still does make sense that if you can get a Trump's core base, if you can get a percentage of them to come along with you, that gives you a starting platform that you can build on the expansion that Trump saw in 2020. The biggest thing that surprised me in the 2020 presidential election is that Trump did actually expand his voter base. He got way more votes than anybody thought he would ever get. So I understand the calculation of if I could just get most of that 30 to 35% that are hardcore Trumpers, if I can get them, and then I can take his message and just shine it up a little bit, just from a personality perspective, not be a colossal douche 24/7, that might be enough to get me to where I need to be. Yeah. And what that does is if you can get Trump's endorsement or somehow transfer those votes to you, now you've got a much smaller market or a much smaller target that you've got to hit to be viable. And I think they're just making the calculation that's still the easiest path forward for a Republican.
And see, I think that's where they're miscalculating, because I think while that can be effective in primaries, and that will be, I mean, having Trump's blessing is going to be make or break in Republican primaries going forward. It's not going to be in the general, because Trump is a completely unique character in the political realm. And I think you can try to imitate him and emulate his who he is. But much of what draws people to Trump, those who support him vigorously, is not policy, it's style. They like his style, they like the way he acts, and they think he speaks to them in a way that other politicians don't. And the problem with Hawley and Cruz is that they are detested and disliked by large swaths of the population because they are politicians and they come across as politicians. They don't have Trump's style. They don't have his bravado. They don't have his temperament. And so much of what is appealing about Trump is personality and style. It's not substance. And, it's interesting, too, because Cruz and Hawley, for different reasons, their stock in their own states has plummeted. Hawley, I think, is sitting at well below 45% approval. I think he's below 40% of the state of Missouri, much lower than Trump's approval in the state of Missouri. And so, I don't think that's going to necessarily translate. And I don't think it could without Trump on the ballot anyway. I think that would be challenging in the best of times. But that's going to be the challenge for the Republican Party going forward, because it's one thing to say that you have Trump support and you support his agenda, whatever that is, America first. But without a Trump on the ballot, you're going to have a challenge in trying to get those voters out. It's a weird needle
they're trying to thread, in that I have to be Trumpy enough to gain Trump's endorsement to get those people on board with me, his hardcore supporters, but I can't overdo it where I become so toxic now that I have no appeal to traditional suburban Republicans. And can you figure?
Yeah. And that's what so many of them are finding difficulty with. I mean, a good example is Nikki Haley. I mean, look at how Nikki Haley has gone back and forth trying to thread that needle. And really, you can't. I mean, because you can't do it in a way that comes across as sincere without looking inauthentic and looking like a calculating politician.
Excuse me. Yeah, I see no way to execute that successfully, because there's no way you could gain Trump's the only way Trump's block voters switch to another candidate, I think, or enthusiastically switch to another candidate. And to your point, in the numbers that they will vote that makes that block meaningful, is you're going to have a direct endorsement from Trump. I think that's very hard to get. And if you get that direct endorsement from Trump.
And even when you have the direct endorsement, that doesn't always pay off either. I mean, Chris Kobach had that direct endorsement in the governor's race in Kansas and wasn't able to still make it work. So it is very tough because, again, many of these voters are very fickle. They do not come out and vote frequently and regularly. And so they had Trump for some people on the right and for this coalition he created was kind of a once in a lifetime candidate. And so it's like, how do you remake that?
Trump throwing his support or endorsing someone like Josh Hawley or Ted Cruz would probably actually be a net negative for them, because you're right. There's no way that person can turn out the number of voters in Trump's base that Trump could. And at that point, if you are on stage with Trump as he's endorsing you, raising your hand as he is the champion moving forward, you just lost the suburbs again. So there's no path through that, I don't think, where you come out the end with both of those support blocks intact.
And a good example of that, Craig, is what we saw happen in Georgia during the special elections, because, their turnout was highest for a special election probably in a century there, but it was still lower than the November election, which is what you would expect, right? The general election. The difference was Trump's base voters, less of them turned out at a greater degree than Democratic voters. So that fall off was higher on the right among Trump's base than it was among Democrats. And that's something that you're going to see in many of these races where you have a Trump endorsed candidate, where the left is going to be fired up to get out and vote against that person. And you have the right that's just going to be kind of, and not fired up to get out at all.
Let's end talking about, I believe it's H.R. 1, which is the new voting rights bill that's passed, I believe, in the House and has no chance to pass the Senate with the filibuster in place. And critics of this bill, and I think there is some legitimacy to this, is, hey, the thing that kept the democracy alive in some narratives is the fact that we have this disjointed 50-state election system that the federal government or no one entity can grab control of. There are elements of this bill that much strengthens the federal government's presence and impact on national elections. So if people are hesitant about this bill and point to recent events to say, while as weird and disjointed as the process was in 2020, it ultimately did work. And I think this comes down to, again, just your core difference in how you see voting. Is voting a privilege that you need to exercise as a privilege, and you have responsibilities as a citizen to complete the steps to be able to have the privilege to vote? Or is voting a right that should be automatically triggered simply by being an American? And you have Democrats for political purposes see it one way, and Republicans for political purposes see it a different way.
Yeah. And so this isn't a black and white issue. I think there's different aspects of this legislation to consider. So, from this does federalize voting procedures and regulations to a degree that we haven't ever seen before in this country. And so I think that's the fear and the downside, because really the decentralized voting system we have state by state is what saved our democracy this last time around from somebody like Donald Trump and his attempts to interfere, because he doesn't have that power. In a federalized voting system, he could do some lasting damage, because he would control those mechanisms and the appointees who would oversee all of that if it was federalized. So that's number one, is that, our decentralized system prevents that from happening, but it also guards against outside powers and foreign interference in our elections as well. It's difficult for the Russians or the Chinese to completely hack our elections, because we have 50 different state elections, essentially, and different procedures and different voting systems and different machinery. So really, it's impossible for a foreign power to completely hack and impact an election. They could do some states or try to do it state by state, but they can't do it fully. And so those are the benefits to what we have now. I think the challenge for Democrats that you see is that Democrats see Republicans rolling back voting rights as far as advanced voting, vote by mail, making it easier to vote. So all of these regulations are being rolled back, and Democrats realize the only way that they can prevent that is through federal legislation, because they don't control enough state legislatures to be able to impact the process. And that is something that would have a lasting effect on their ability to get out the vote, and for their side. And I think you can argue back and forth. It is interesting. There's some aspects of voting that we do make it more difficult than other countries. I mean, a lot of democracies have either automatic voter registration, or it's automatic. You get to register when you vote when you go to the DMV. In our country, there's some states that have automatic voter registration questions asked when you register your vehicle. Others that do not. We do have that decentralized system. So there is a push to just kind of enshrine a lot of this in law. But there are downsides. But I think for Democrats, they see this as their one opportunity to lock in the gains that they've made. So if there was ever a way to get rid of the filibuster, they are going to leverage the push to pass this voting rights legislation to do it.
This isn't where the federal government is like taking over the administration of an election or the certification of an election. This doesn't say that the federal government is going to buy Dominion voting machines and put them and everybody would vote off those machines, and the federal government would certify individual state election results. Basically, what it does is it tries to codify some of the election access rules that came into place in 2020. So, for example, I believe there's some rules around what is the protecting the period and defining the period for early voting. There are rules around no excuse absentee voting. There's
having a minimum.
Yes. There's rules around ballot harvesting. Yeah. There's rules around automatically registering people to vote. I don't necessarily have a problem with some of that. Where this is going to be very difficult is, again, the percentage chance of a Republican winning the presidency, if this law goes into effect, drops by how many percentage points, Brandon?
Oh, in terms of quantifying it?
Yeah.
Substantially. I think just because it standardizes it across all the states, and especially these swing states where, they have Republican legislatures that control the process, and maybe Democratic governors, states like Arizona, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, that, turned the tide this last time around, Georgia. Yep.
I think it's fair to say, and I'm just making this up, but the odds of a Republican becoming president drop by 25 to 30% if this bill passes. And the only way they get this through the Senate is if they take the step to get rid of the filibuster. And as you said, Brandon, the filibuster, it's just a procedural rule. It takes 51 votes to get rid of it. It can have a shelf life from one Senate session to the next, because who's ever in power gets to set those rules, basically. Do the Democrats, you think, are they going to get that bold? Will they do that, which would be a huge change to how the government functions, and then turn right around? And the reason they made this huge change is to force another huge change in elections. That would be a very, very bold stance by the Democrats.
Yeah, no, that would be very bold, but I could see them trying to do it. And the question is, how do you get Manchin and Sinema on board? Because that requires getting every Democrat and knowing you're not going to get every Republican. So that is a tall task. That doesn't mean it can't be overcome. I would see probably some deal making and a lot of a fury of negotiations with those two senators to do it. But if they're going to do it, it's going to be for something like that that's going to have lasting impact. It's not going to be for just any legislation.
Do you think the Democrats run in 2022 in their Senate races based on, if you give us more seats, we will end the filibuster?
I think that, they would. I mean, I think that's a winning message for Democratic voters, because they see this as frustration and not being able to progress on, core progressive priorities. And so the filibuster is the only way to overcome that, because as long as you have that 60 vote minimum to block, you can't get anything done. And I think Democrats would point and say, look, Republicans already carved out an exception for judges. We're just saying, hey, let's carve out the exception for everything and let's just do away with it completely. And if you don't do away with the filibuster, I have heard some compromising where you just make it more akin to an actual filibuster, make it difficult, require that there be 40 senators there who debate continually. Like, we've operated under these rules, and people seem to think filibusters are like Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, and that's not how it's done. It's basically the threat of a filibuster, and that just kills legislation. But the minority never actually has to make good on that promise. Like, actually have them make good, force them to do this for several days on end with no interruption, and see if that's something they want to continue to employ. That might change the way that they operate.
As we wrap up here, Brandon, I'll share with the audience that we've had huge technical problems during this podcast. So if this podcast comes out, it's going to be a mashup of like 4 different files we've had. So just telling the audience, if this one sounds weird, we've had several technical problems. There's delays and other stuff. So we'll piece this together the best we can. But this one may sound a little funky when it comes out. Like that 3-second pause, because for some reason, we've got delay issues, disconnection issues, the whole bit. I wanted to end with, there's a podcast that I've been listening to that actually I would say I'm obsessed with. I drove to Florida and back this week, which is about 40 hours in the car, and actually could have driven more because of this podcast. Yeah, I drove to Florida.
I didn't realize you drove there.
Yeah, it was time for a good long road trip, so it was fun. But the podcast is called Revolutions. It's by Mike Duncan. There are 10 seasons to this. They cover 10 of the most consequential revolutions in our history: the American Revolution, the Spanish Revolution, the Mexican Revolution, and the one that I've become fascinated with is the Russian Revolution. And I think I'm 54 episodes into this and finally are caught up. But this is a long, long conversation that covers the formation of Russia, our Marxist theory and history. If you've got the time and history podcast are your jam, Revolutions is certainly one that will not disappoint.
Well, I will definitely check that out. I'm intrigued because as a history buff, that revolutions are fascinating to me.
Yeah, you're not going to get through this quickly because, like I said, the Russian season is really spread over 3 years. Because this guy, he's writing a book in the middle of it, but I don't think you'll be disappointed.
And what's Brandon, his name, Craig, again?
It's Mike Duncan, and the podcast is Revolutions. It's their 30-minute segments. It's an easy listen, and it's fascinating. And if you have any interest in political history or political theory or history of Europe, this is a really, really good podcast to get into. Okay, Brandon, I think we have to check it out.
There's also really.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, no, I was going to say there's a really good series on Netflix called The Last Tsars about the Russian Revolution as well. Tsar Nicholas II, for those who want to also brush up on that history.
I mean, being a czar would be terrible because half of them got murdered.
Yeah. Sounds pretty miserable.
Half of them got murdered with their wife's or child's permission. I mean, the Russians were very courteous before they killed a czar. They always went to the wife and made sure she was cool with it. But, if we said, Brandon, great news, you're the next czar of Russia, you knew there was a 50-50 chance that someone was going to smoke you, for holding that job. So it plays out like a soap opera, all kinds of palace intrigue, assassinations. It's really, really interesting. Okay, Brandon, we probably have to call it there to see if we have anything usable for this. So we'll see how this goes. Thanks, Brandon.
Thanks for listening to 2 Men in the Middle. Make sure to give us a 5-star review wherever you get your podcasts. Check out our website at 2meninthemiddle.com. Drop us an email at 2meninthemiddle@gmail.com or tweet at us at 2 Men in the Middle. We'll see you next week.